All right, we're back for another week of In Case You Missed It. It's hard to believe it's already been a week. These days are flying by, and now we're in the month of October. So, what a wild year it's been, and it's also been a pretty interesting week when it comes to the world of technology and government. There's a few things that stood out to us this week. One thing that I'll kind of kick things off with. Phil and Terry wrote an article. So Phil Bertolini and Terry Takai are co-directors of our Center for Digital Government through Government Technology. And they wrote an article about speaking to the business of government and a new role for CIOs. And what was interesting about this was just the fact that they make some really good points about CIOs have really been forced into new positions this year. And, it's very easy to get caught up into the technology side of things. But, this year has really brought in a whole new set of stakeholders for CIOs to deal with. And that's important for the market to understand as well, because now you have, line of business leaders, you have policymakers, you have a variety of, different types of stakeholders that are involved in the decision-making process for government technology. And so it's more important than ever for technology leaders in government to really understand how to speak the business of government. So they do a really good job of kind of explaining that and why that's more important than ever. And, I think right now is a critical time, as we start to look at where everything is going to land for CIOs to kind of redefine what their role is longer term in the context of, how they're going to go about operating in their organizations and, really what their decision-making role is at the table of all of the other priorities that are there. So Joe, what'd you make of this one?
No, it's sound advice. It's certainly something that we are seeing in terms of the pandemic impact, but it's advice that we've also been giving before in our 10 Laws series, is to broaden the suite of decision makers that industry talks to and to get into the line of business. And now that same advice is being given to the CIOs as well.
So we also saw some big news from some major players in the market with some new vertical moves into permitting and different types of management. Joe, talk a little bit about what happened.
Yeah, yesterday Salesforce announced a couple new offerings, one around vaccine management and the other around online permitting and licensing. Certainly the vaccine management conversation has been heating up over I'd say the last maybe 60 days. So Salesforce just launched another capability on work.com that's an extension of their work that they were doing in the tracing efforts and sanitization and scheduling. And now we're getting into vaccine management. So everything around inventory management, outreach, scheduling, pre-screenings, surveys, adverse reactions, a lot of these challenges that are starting to emerge as we start talking more about a vaccine. Salesforce certainly isn't alone in these conversations. I've been hearing a lot more discussion in the industry around applications around vaccine management, but Salesforce moved quickly and launched. And they didn't just launch around vaccine management. They got into another very active market, and that's licensing and permitting. Later this month, Salesforce will officially get into licensing and permitting, but they made the announcement just yesterday around land permitting, health and safety, recreation, professional licenses. Obviously, this is a market that we've been talking about for quite some time. It's very active in the number of players that are servicing this space, everyone from Excella to Tyler to Central Square, OpenGov, and many others. But now you've got a large platform player in here with Salesforce, and it's going to be interesting to see what impact Salesforce has on licensing and permitting, and of course, the vaccine management space.
Yeah, and I think what was interesting to me is it really validated what we've been talking about around these GovTech platforms, kind of expanding into these new vertical specific capabilities. And so this was an example of, a CRM that's a critical system of record in government that is expanded into different types of, vertical specific applications that all tie back to that core customer data. So, we expect to see more of these types of platforms look at these vertical expansions. We've seen it with Excella, we've seen it with Tyler Technologies, we've seen it with Civic Plus, and even Unicode to a certain extent, right? There's a huge kind of emphasis on trying to provide these vertical capabilities that all tie back to that core data that you have. That's kind of your critical administrative and financial data that these agencies are dealing with. So interesting news there. We also had some news from space. So SpaceX, as many people are aware, is launching micro kind of CubeSats in low Earth orbit. So there's about 775 in orbit right now. And essentially what these satellites are designed to do is provide connectivity. And, this is something that's been talked about. You've got a variety of different players in this space. You've even got, AWS and Microsoft that are all providing, ground to low Earth orbit satellite capabilities from a technology standpoint. But what's been really interesting is we're starting to move beyond just that concept phase, and we're getting into where the technology is actually coming into real use cases. And in this case, Starlink, which is the SpaceX version of their internet capabilities, actually is providing capabilities to those in the state of Washington emergency kind of response when it comes to wildfires. And they're using this as a communication backbone to provide that connectivity where maybe traditional outlets have been destroyed by wildfires. And this is a really interesting use case of just how some of this connectivity can really become more accessible, and it has state and local government relevance here too. And it is a vital communication backbone, but you start to get into some of the other use cases around imagery. And Dennis McKenna and I wrote an article we talked a little bit about, I think, on one of our earlier episodes, just that space as a platform. And it sounds crazy, sounds like sci-fi, but increasingly these satellites are becoming a platform for all kinds of capability. In fact, there's some companies that are doing leak detection from space using this level of infrastructure, and it's becoming more accessible to agencies to tap into it because they don't have to actually own the satellite. They don't have to launch the satellite. They can just reap the benefit and almost leverage it as a new form of cloud. Joe, what do you make of this one?
Yeah, it's interesting. You're right. It goes back to some of the earlier work that you and Dennis wrote about. But what was interesting to me, was someone that's living in the West. Fire season's happening now every year. It's getting more and more significant. So the use cases are going to extend obviously beyond Washington into California and Oregon and many others. But it wasn't just emergency response. If I'm recalling correctly, they also extended it into education, so to provide emergency connectivity into schools. Obviously, with everyone being connected with regard to the pandemic, either working from home or doing school from home, these types of solutions, when your connectivity is destroyed because of a natural disaster, are pretty, obviously into the mission critical aspect of what we talk about quite often.
Absolutely. And when you think about IoT and kind of edge computing in the future of that, having kind of this backbone is going to be more important than ever for agencies to think about. Now, we've also seen some news and some headlines, and this is something, we talked about because originally we were tracking on federal legislation that was going to come after the CARES Act that was going to provide vital resources for state and local government agencies. As we all know, that didn't happen, but now there's chatter again, and we're starting to get more questions about is this new package actually going to pass? Is it going to provide aid for state and local government? So, Joe, I know you've been tracking this one really closely. What are you seeing here?
Yeah, I think you're always trying to figure out, if there's smoke, is there going to be fire, right? And I think in this case, this is a trimmed down HEROES bill. If you recall, the HEROES bill came out months and months ago from the House. They passed it. It was $3 trillion. Then the Republicans came back with about a $1.2 trillion program called the HEALS package. So there was this big divide. Now we're getting it down to about $2.2 trillion from the House. And obviously, it's still got to work its way through the Senate. The Senate's been very resistant to passing additional spending programs. So we're still stuck in the same spot that we were before. I'd say the one sliver of hope is that the Department of Treasury came back shortly after this news broke with their own version, and it's about $1.6 trillion. It would include about $250 billion to aid to states and localities. And that meant that the House Democrats and others have postponed their vote on this bill as the negotiations continue. So I think if I'm looking at it, we start at 3, we went to 1, we're at 2.2, 1.6, we're getting closer. Maybe that means that we may see something pass. But unfortunately, nothing yet. We'll continue to monitor it, but it looks like maybe the sides are getting closer, and we may be more likely to see something here before the end of the year. So with that said, I think that brings us to the end of this week's episode, covering what we saw and what we thought were interesting this week in GovTech. We'll be back at it again next Friday. If you want to check out this episode or past episodes, check out ICYMI.video. Thanks for joining.
We'll see you next week.